There is a cure, and that cure is female orgasm.
2011, a woman walks onto a TED stage and promises to hack the female orgasm.
This is really the first time that it's been through an institutional review board that we have two people who are interacting in the laboratory. We're measuring both of them, and that of course is huge.
15 minutes of orgasmic meditation would cure everything. Depression, anxiety, even hunger. Revolutionary, right? But wait, what she didn't mention in that TED Talk is that students were paying up to $60,000 to live in company housing and work for free. And it gets worse. By 2025, that same woman was convicted of forced labor conspiracy. The FBI called it exploitation. So the woman who promised to liberate female sexuality was actually running a cult that trapped people for decades. Was Nicole Daedone a sexual revolutionary, or just really good at selling slavery as salvation? This is Scamnomics, and this is how 20 years of healing became a federal crime. Meet Nicole Daedone, Stanford MBA, TEDx speaker, best-selling author. In Silicon Valley, she looked exactly like what venture capitalists dream of funding. A charismatic founder with a revolutionary idea that could scale globally. Her pitch? Women everywhere are broken, disconnected from their bodies, suffering from what she called orgasmic dysfunction, and she had the cure.
I do think, though, that there is a cure, and that cure is orgasm. But it's going to be a very different definition of orgasm than we know.
Daedone founded One Taste in 2004, promising to teach something she invented called orgasmic meditation, a practice that would heal trauma, unlock creativity, and transform relationships. Not through years of therapy or expensive retreats in Bali. Through 15 minutes of structured genital stimulation performed by trained practitioners. She didn't position herself as a sex worker or even a relationship coach. She positioned herself as a spiritual innovator, a business disruptor, a thought leader solving humanity's deepest problem, our disconnection from pleasure. And here's the thing about selling healing instead of selling products. The margins are infinite. You can't manufacture enlightenment in China and ship it in bulk. You can't counterfeit spiritual awakening. When your product is transformation itself, you could charge whatever you want, because how do you put a price on becoming whole? The early believers weren't desperate people seeking quick fixes. They were successful professionals, entrepreneurs, artists, intelligent adults who could afford to pay premium prices for premium experiences. Daedone built her first following the same way every successful cult leader does, by targeting people who already had everything except the one thing money can't buy: inner peace. By 2012, One Taste had centers in major cities, corporate workshops for companies like Google, and celebrity endorsements. Nicole Daedone wasn't running a sex business, she was running a wellness empire. So, what exactly is orgasmic meditation? Imagine the most intimate moment of your life, stripped of all emotion, romance, or spontaneity, and turned into a clinical procedure with precise instructions, mandatory positions, and performance metrics.
To what may be the cutting edge of female sexploration, the One Taste Urban Retreat.
The process is bizarrely specific. The woman removes clothing from the waist down and lies on a nest of pillows. The partner, called the stroker, sits beside her right hip. One finger, upper left quadrant of the clitoris, light, consistent pressure. 15 minutes exactly. No variation. No creativity. No deviation from the script. There's a timer. There are rules. There are coaches watching to ensure proper technique. The woman is instructed to report what she feels in real time using approved vocabulary. More pressure, lighter touch, good, nothing else. They insisted this wasn't sex. Sex, they claimed, was goal-oriented, driven by climax and ego. OM was different. OM was about connection, presence, authentic feeling. OM was spiritual practice disguised as physical touch. But strip away the jargon, and OM was something much simpler. A way to make strangers comfortable with crossing boundaries they would never cross in normal circumstances. New members were told to let go of shame, control, and logic, to trust the process, to surrender their instincts about what felt safe or appropriate. The genius wasn't in the practice itself. The genius was in making something deeply sexual feel clinical and pure. When you medicalize intimacy, when you wrap it in spiritual language and wellness terminology, people will participate in things they would normally consider unthinkable, especially when everyone around them is calling it healing. Nicole Daedone understood something fundamental about human psychology. People don't just want community, they want to belong to something that makes them special. One Taste didn't just offer OM classes. They offered membership in an enlightened inner circle that understood truths ordinary people couldn't grasp. New members were encouraged to move into communal houses with other practitioners, to spend their weekends at One Taste centers instead of with old friends, to attend multiple sessions per week, workshops, intensives, coaching calls. The company called this commitment to growth. Former members called it isolation. Inside the One Taste bubble, Nicole wasn't just a teacher. She was a living example of what full awakening looked like. Her word became law. Her interpretation of events became truth. When members expressed doubt about practices or policies, they were told their resistance was evidence of their own dysfunction, their own inability to surrender to the process. Privacy disappeared. Personal boundaries became obstacles to growth. Questioning the teachings became a character flaw that needed fixing. And here's what's brilliant about owning someone's reality. Once you control how they interpret their own experiences, you never have to pay them fairly for their work. When exploitation feels like enlightenment, people will thank you for the opportunity to be used. The real masterpiece wasn't OM itself. The real masterpiece was the sales funnel Nicole Daedone built around it. She turned spiritual seeking into a tiered pricing structure that would make luxury brands jealous. It started innocent enough, introductory workshops for a few $100s. Try OM, see how it feels, discover what you've been missing. But that was just the appetizer. Once people experienced their first session, once they felt that mixture of vulnerability and connection and transcendence that comes from crossing intimate boundaries with strangers, they wanted more. By 2018, students were paying $499 for a weekend course, $4,000 for a retreat, $12,000 for a spot in the coaching program, and $16,000 for intensives, with an all-inclusive option also offered for $60,000. And at the very top, private access to Nicole herself, $100,000 for the privilege of learning directly from the founder. But the real money wasn't in the workshops. The real money was in the labor. One Taste needed bodies for demonstrations during corporate presentations. They needed attractive people to stroke VIP guests and potential investors. They needed staff to work events, manage centers, recruit new members. And they had discovered something remarkable. When you convince people that serving the mission is part of their spiritual path, they'll work for free and feel grateful for the opportunity. Members became unpaid sales staff required to meet recruiting quotas. They became demonstration models expected to perform OM with strangers during marketing events. They became free labor, working 12 hours a day at centers while being told their exhaustion was resistance to growth. One Taste leaders also didn't pay promised earnings to the members turned workers, and even forced some of them to take out new credit cards to continue taking the company's courses. Nicole had built something unprecedented, a sexual pyramid scheme, where the product being sold was enlightenment itself. And the sales force was convinced they were saving the world, one orgasm at a time. The testimonials on One Taste's website told stories of transformation, healing, and spiritual awakening. But behind closed doors, a different story was emerging. Former members began speaking out about experiences that felt less like therapy and more like systematic sexual coercion. women reported being pressured to OM with high-paying customers, major donors, and potential investors, not as part of their own healing journey, but as part of One Taste's business development strategy. When they expressed discomfort, they were told their boundaries were evidence of sexual shame that needed to be healed through more OM practice. Michal, a former member, later described the psychological manipulation. These 7 men, who I think were named the priests of orgasm, would stroke them in this ritual fashion, and they would all rotate through. And we would come up and they would hug you in a weird, almost sexual embrace. And that was the idea, that they had f***ed the war out of us. The grooming was sophisticated. New members weren't immediately asked to cross major boundaries. First, they were asked to share personal sexual histories in group settings, then to receive feedback about their bodies from near strangers, then to practice OM with people they barely knew. Each step felt reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a progression toward total compliance. Staff members worked 16 hours a day without pay, while being told their exhaustion was spiritual growth. They lived in company housing where privacy didn't exist, and dissent wasn't tolerated. They had their relationships, their finances, their self-worth completely intertwined with Nicole's approval. What started as a wellness workshop had become something indistinguishable from a high-control group using sexual access as both carrot and stick. The promise of healing had become a sophisticated system of harm. By 2018, of course, the facade was cracking. A Bloomberg investigation published detailed accounts from former members describing financial exploitation, sexual coercion, and systematic psychological manipulation. The FBI opened an investigation into forced labor and sex trafficking allegations.
According to an unsealed federal indictment, former One Taste founder and CEO Nicole Daedone and former One Taste head of sales Rachel Cherwitz obtained the labor and services of One Taste members by subjecting them to economic, sexual, emotional, and psychological abuse, surveillance, indoctrination, and intimidation between 2006 and 2018.
Nicole Daedone stepped down as CEO. One Taste announced it was suspending all operations pending legal review. The company's social media went dark. The website disappeared. For casual observers, it looked like accountability had finally arrived. But scams don't just die. They evolve. Within months, former One Taste instructors were offering private OM sessions under new business names. The company itself rebranded as the Institute of OM Foundation, positioning itself as a research organization rather than a commercial enterprise. The same practices continued at the same locations with the same people, just with softer marketing language and more legal disclaimers. Nicole herself moved to Europe, where she began offering exclusive retreats for wealthy clients seeking advanced consciousness work. Same philosophy, same practices, same power dynamics. New continent, new audience, new legal jurisdiction. The genius of the rebrand was its simplicity. Instead of fighting the allegations, they simply made them irrelevant by changing what they claimed to be doing. They weren't running a commercial sex business anymore. They were conducting research into human sexuality and consciousness. They weren't charging for sexual services. They were accepting donations for spiritual education. And the most loyal followers, they didn't see this as evidence that One Taste was a scam. They saw it as persecution of enlightened teachings by a society too sexually repressed to understand revolutionary healing work. What makes the One Taste story different from typical cult exposés is that this wasn't just about a charismatic leader exploiting vulnerable followers. This was about turning human intimacy into a subscription service, packaging sexual access as spiritual advancement. The real product One Taste was selling wasn't orgasms or even enlightenment. It was emotional debt. They made people feel fundamentally incomplete, then positioned themselves as the exclusive source of wholeness. Once someone accepted the premise that they needed healing only One Taste could provide. Every boundary they crossed felt like progress. Every dollar they spent felt like investment in their future self. The sexual component was essential. Physical intimacy creates powerful psychological bonds. When you combine that with group pressure, social isolation, and constant reinforcement that questioning the process means you're spiritually deficient, you create a level of compliance that purely intellectual cults can never achieve. Members were paying to feel special, chosen, part of an enlightened community that understood secrets ordinary people couldn't grasp. They were paying for the fantasy that their sexual experiences were actually spiritual work, that their submission to Nicole's authority was actually personal empowerment. And that's the most profitable product in the world. Selling people the story they desperately want to believe about themselves. Once someone has invested their identity in being the kind of person who does advanced consciousness work, who isn't limited by conventional sexual morality, who has transcended ordinary human dysfunction, they'll pay anything to maintain that self-image. Spiritual scarcity is the ultimate renewable resource. No matter how much enlightenment someone achieves, there's always another level, another breakthrough, another healing that only the guru can provide. The debt never gets paid off because the goal keeps moving. They called it healing. They called it transformation. They called it the future of human sexuality and spiritual growth. But behind the wellness candles, the TED Talks, and the celebrity endorsements was something much older and more familiar. A predator who had found the perfect disguise. Nicole Daedone didn't invent sexual exploitation. She didn't even invent spiritual manipulation. What she invented was a business model that made both feel like premium lifestyle choices for educated, successful adults who should have known better. One Taste didn't sell orgasms, it sold surrender, the fantasy that giving up your judgment, your boundaries, your autonomy was actually the path to empowerment. And once you've surrendered your ability to recognize manipulation when it's happening to you, you'll pay anything to feel whole again. The centers may have closed. The company may have rebranded. Nicole Daedone may be offering retreats in Portugal instead of workshops in San Francisco. But the model she perfected, turning vulnerability into profit, intimacy into leverage, healing into harm. That model is still out there, waiting for the next charismatic founder to discover that the most expensive product you can sell isn't a thing at all. It's the promise that somewhere, somehow, someone has the secret to fixing everything that's wrong with you. And all you have to do is trust them completely.